Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Suzanne Spear, Director of Workforce Development here at ACU. This is our third installment of ACU's four-part webinar series on compensation strategies. Today, we will be looking at the impact of pay policies on organizational structures and organizational effectiveness. For those that might have missed the first two of this webinar series, they're archived on our website. Just some housekeeping items before we begin today. We will be recording this webinar and it will be emailed to you at the completion of the call. If you would like to access a copy of the slides prior to receiving them, they are located in the handout section of the Go To toolbar on the right side of the screen. Also, feel free to ask any questions you may have. If you do have a question during the call, use your raise your hand tool in the control bar of the right side of your screen to alert our team that you have a question. You can use either the chat or question box in the control bar to send your question to our team, and we will direct them to the presenter for an answer. If you have a question after this broadcast or would like to follow up for more information on anything presented here today, you can email Mariah Blake at mblake@clinicians.org. Finally, there will be a brief survey at the end of the webinar, so please take a few minutes and complete it for us. We are excited to once again have Ed Ura with Merces Consulting with us today. And with that, Ed, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who is here with us this afternoon. A couple of little, very hopefully brief housekeeping notices on my side of things. It's a very windy day here and in the Detroit area, and we've had some wind noise rustling through the windows. So if you hear what sounds like a whooshing going by, it is probably the wind. You also may hear a train go by. We have a wonderful office overlooking the train tracks, and every once in a while they make a little bit of noise. So if you hear me kind of go quiet for a couple of seconds, that's what it's going to be. Having said that, let's jump right into our topic for today, which is the impact of pay policies on organization structures and organizational effectiveness. This is kind of an opposite look at the whole area of pay programs. The first couple of sessions, we've actually looked at it from what I consider the direction we should be looking at, that is having pay programs that are designed to achieve our mission. Frequently, however, what actually happens is the opposite, and today we'll talk about what happens in the opposite. So just to kind of take a look at where we've been so far, we started off a few weeks ago, advancing a slide, hopefully, there we go. We started off a few weeks ago with an overview of what makes an effective compensation program, and that was based on the idea that we all know what we're trying to do. We have a mission as employers and as organizations, and we have a strategy to carry it out, and we go out and develop programs and policies that help us do that. So we looked first at sort of what the outline of that would look like, and that's actually sort of the basis for a tool that we're actually developing for the association that will help you assess various aspects of your pay programs and provide you with a little bit of guidance into what you could do to improve them. We then went on the last time to talk about how to set specific rates of pay for individuals in a effective compensation program. So we looked at program design, and then we looked at how to actually use a program using the information we have on employees' performance to actually determine exactly what somebody should make. So I think it's very appropriate that we return to my favorite quote from Sun Tzu in The Art of War, the idea that in order for us to win our battle, and of course our battle is won when we serve our patients. In order for us to win our battle, we have to be ready, and we have to be able to put out in the field, put out in our clinics, those kinds of people that are actually going to be able to achieve this. So we want to win the war before the war actually starts. And of course, we all know that battle plans never survive the first bullet, but we at least want to be going in the right direction. So what we're going to do today is to see sort of what happens when things go wrong and how you can tell within your own organization when some of these things have gone wrong and what it might mean. So how's it all supposed to work? Well, let's go back and think about that for a second. We all have a mission. We're supposed to have a a mission statement, and our mission statements are probably up on our walls in our conference rooms and in the break rooms to remind everybody that we're here to provide high quality health care services to the underserved. That's what our mission is. We should all be clear about that. Most organizations are relatively clear about that, but some are a little bit off the beaten path and off the track a little while. But from that mission, we devise strategies. So if you've got a mission statement and you go off and do one of those great strategic planning sessions, you come up with strategies about how you're going to do that. And with those strategies, you're then able to develop processes. How do we go about seeing patients? How do we go about finding patients? How do we get them through the process of delivering care to them? In order to have those processes and have those processes work, we have to develop compensation programs amongst a whole bunch of other things. And trust me, I know there's a lot more to it than just pay programs. But for our purposes, we have to develop pay programs that will allow us to actually recruit and retain the kind of people we need to execute the processes that lead to meeting our strategy and then, of course, eventually meeting our mission. And only after that do we actually get into the people aspect of it, because the pay programs dictate the people we're going to be able to get. And you might be able to see already where I'm going here, because if our pay programs are not dictating the right kinds of people to achieve our mission, we're going to have some issues. So how do we do this on a practical basis? How do we set up a structure, and how do we make sure we have the right people in place? Well, the first thing we do is we plan for performance of certain tasks at a certain level in order to achieve certain objectives. That's our operational strategy, if you will. These are the services we're going to provide. These are the tasks that need to be performed and in this volume, and this will achieve these certain objectives of ours. So what we do with that is we figure out essentially how many different jobs we have. And a job, as I mentioned a few weeks back, is a logical collection of duties and responsibilities. One of the things that in our world we tend to do is have people do whatever they can. And that may work for a little while, but when people leave and we can't fill them again, or when the jobs get to be too big for most people to stand, we eventually have to come up with jobs that are actually logical, consistent sets of duties and responsibilities where skill sets actually appear in nature. So we start with this idea of planning for performance of tasks. We can then figure out what the cost of that is, and we'll talk about this a little more in detail in the next slide. We can look at what the cost of each box on that organization chart that we've designed is going to be. We can look at what the value of that job is and how much it's going to cost us to do that. Then, of course, that's going to tell us whether we can actually do the things that we said we were going to do. And I think sometimes that's the missing step that people don't actually go through. They say, this is what we're going to do. They count up the number of people that they're going to need to do it, and they go out and hire. And they never really stop to think, will we actually be able to achieve these objectives with what we have to work with in terms of resources, and how to get people and how to keep them? And of course, what we can do then is look at this design, both at the individual level and at the organizational level, and benchmark it. So we can look at data, whether it comes from reviews of Form 990s or UDS reports or whatever it happens to be, and we can compare our design against other organizations, maybe other organizations that we know are performing at a certain level, or maybe the performance levels of the median of the market or the 75th percentile of the market, or whatever target we want to be in based on the kinds of people that we need and the work we're trying to do. And it's really essential that we do this, and it's essential that we do this up front. I often tell people, some of our clients that we're working with, please don't go do strategic planning without at least letting us sit in and listen. And the reason I do that is because frequently, strategic planning is great, especially when we get our board members together and we all sit around and have a great meal and talk about what we want to look like when we grow up. And frequently what we do is set objectives, but there isn't any point at which we go back before we approve our plan where we actually say, can this be done? And is this reasonable? And does it look like what other organizations like us are able to do? So it's really essential in this design phase, and this is not just when you're starting up an organization. Frankly, you should be doing it all the time, looking at the design of your organization and seeing if, in fact, you can actually meet these numbers that you may put up or these goals that you set. And you can do that based on how other organizations are able to do all of that. So how do we set the price? Well, we've talked about this before, and I apologize to those who have heard it a couple times, but I know not all of us have. When we determine what the price tag is, what the price that we're going to have to pay is for our employees, they're going to fill all those boxes on an organization chart, we have basically three things that we always have to consider. The first thing that we have to consider is the value of the job to the organization. That's an internal look at where jobs fit. Some jobs, the value of the job is actually set primarily from the outside. So if we look at the cost of a physician, well, the cost of a physician is the cost of a physician. The cost of a pharmacist is the cost of a pharmacist, et cetera. But once we leave that real simple, this is what the job costs thing, we have to be able to have a mechanism for establishing what the value of that job is to us. So when we look at a family practice physician and all that person, and I'm sorry to say all, but what that person is doing is practicing medicine, we know what that value is, but what is the value when we add, say, being the medical director or being in charge of a clinic? What is the value add to that? We're not going to be able to find references out in the market, so we have to know what the value is inside. What is the value for our medical assistants, the way they perform tasks? I went over at least a couple times so far in past webinars, this whole idea that in our environment, because of the patients we deal with, because of the regulations we deal with, frequently staff all the way from the bottom to the top simply have more difficult jobs to do than in private practice or in a hospital or other kind of medical clinic setting. We have to know what those differences are to make sure when we are setting our target prices for individuals, that is what we're going to pay them, that we are actually able to measure that difference and account for it. Because as we all know, while frequently people may leave us for another $1 an hour, sometimes they'll leave us for the same pay for just an easier job. And we want to make sure that if our jobs are more difficult or more challenging or more complex or have multiple roles, that we are incorporating that into our model. So if you go back and listen to either of the other webinars, you'll know that we will talk about the concept of job evaluation and specifically point factor job evaluation as a model for doing that. We're not going to go any farther into that today, but recognize that having that kind of internal value system is essential to making sure that we are paying correctly. The second piece is, of course, the value of skills in the market. That's what we're used to. We're used to looking at a survey and making sure that we're paying the right amount. And again, we spent some time the last time around and the time before talking about the things to look out for in survey data. But we have to have that. We have to know what our competitors pay. We have to know what those with similar business models to us pay, because that gives us an idea of how to benchmark against them, how to know what we need to do to compete, and not only to compete in the market, but to actually compete in terms of our overall performance. And finally, and the topic of our entire webinar last time, was how well the employee does the job. And how well the employee does the job is going to be the key to this session as well, because all other things aside, one thing I think most of us will agree on is we can only get what we pay for. Yes, there are people who are going to be mission driven beyond and who don't care about pay. And yes, there are going to be people who just love to work here and would never leave or can't leave for whatever reason. But the bottom line is, to a large extent, what we pay is going to dictate two things. It's going to dictate the labor pool that we're looking at. That is, what can we use to attract people to our organization? And secondarily, whether we can retain them. So we have to make sure that we know what the value of each individual person is as the job is designed. Last time we talked about what happens, when we're not on target, and this time we're going to talk about how that actually goes to the very essence of our organizational structure and our performance. So let's look at an organization chart. What can we tell about this organization chart? Outside the fact that we have a train coming and that I hope it's a short one. What we know, I do apologize, and hopefully this train will pass by quite quickly. Okay, what we know from looking at this organization chart is basically that we have a bunch of boxes, and they're all green, and they're all green for a reason. Because in my view of the world, and actually the way I color code PowerPoint presentations, green always means good. Green always means go. It means that we are doing things the way we are supposed to be. And so this organization chart is designed specifically for the purpose of having a bunch of services done. And there's a bunch of boxes at different levels reporting to different people. And the content of them really doesn't matter. What really does matter, though, and one thing we'll keep in mind, is that in this particular organization design, there are 45 boxes. So we've got 45 people in this organization, and we start with the premise that each one of those people is going to do everything that we have outlined in the job description for those jobs the way it's supposed to be done. So I don't think any organization actually starts from the premise that, well, you know, we'll hire a bunch of people and some of them will be able to do some of the job and some will be able to do other parts of the job, but it's okay if they don't. We're never going to start from that. We may not always be able to get exactly what we want, but we're never going to start from the premise that, yeah, it doesn't matter if we really get what we want. So keep the structure in mind. And if you want to maybe guess ahead as to what Ed's going to say, think of this as a little homework assignment that you can do right now back in your own organization. So pull out a copy of your organization chart or a list of the jobs and color code it yourself. For everybody who's doing the job the way the job is supposed to be done, or even for people who may be learning the job, but they're new, but they're doing a good job and you know they're going to get there, color that box green. If you've got some people who are maybe not doing everything they should be, and we're not going to say they're bad employees, but they're just not going to get to 100%, color that box yellow. And then look at some people who, geez, you just wish they'd leave. The people that we spend an awful lot of time on trying to counsel, or the people that just are never going to be what we want them to be. Color those boxes red and just kind of stick that off to the side for the rest of our presentation, and we'll talk about how it's going to affect you and how your pay program works. Because the reality is this is actually what happens in so many organizations. We flip what we had at the beginning, which was the right way to design and run an organization. And we start with the idea that we have pay programs. Sometimes we don't even know why the pay programs were put in place. We don't know how they came about. They're lost in the mists of time. Maybe we believe that because we're not-for-profit organizations, we can't pay well. Or maybe we started out with limited resources and we never kind of got over that. But we set up pay programs, and those pay programs dictate the type and the nature of people that we are going to get. And what will frequently happen, and we'll hit some of this in more detail as we go along, is that the type of people that we get upset our nice green box organizational chart. Those people can't do the work. Maybe we can't find anybody who can do the work at the level of the little box in the organization chart. And so what we do then is we change our processes. And so rather than have processes in place, whether they're workflows or even job design itself, we change it because of the people we feel we can get. Now, of course, when we change our processes and we have processes in place that are not the ones that are designed to achieve the strategies or the goals and objectives that we set, we're back to not getting to where we want to be. And that's where our results often end up not being where they should be. And when we look at organizations, and certainly when I work with my health center clients and they talk about whether it's productivity or losing money or whatever it happens to be, I don't want to say that it's always the case, but it isn't always the case, because it isn't always the case. But most of the time, a good deal of why they're not hitting their objectives is the people that are working for them. And much of that is the way the jobs have been designed around the people they could get, that then make it virtually impossible to actually perform at the level the organization wants to. So what we end up doing is having everything turned around. And not all, of course, because there's so many other things that go into employment, but from the perspective of pay programs, this is what they do. So what is the big failure of pay programs? What is it that I'm talking about? The big failure of pay programs is two parts. Number one, you can have a program that has not been designed with those first two little circles on my Venn diagram earlier. That is, it doesn't account for the internal value of jobs or the extra duties and responsibilities. Or it's not good because we're picking the wrong competitive data or whatever it is. That's the first way it can go wrong. It can go wrong because the program in itself was poorly designed. But what typically happens is that even when programs are designed well, they suffer from implementation and effectiveness in how they're actually administered. And this is probably best displayed by the pretty little graphic coming up on your screen right about now, which is not just illustrative in that Ed wants to prove a point, but it's illustrative of what actually really does happen, and perhaps you can actually see it in your own organization. So let's say you're hiring, these are obviously rates for an entry-level person. So let's say we're looking at a front desk job, or perhaps an entry-level medical assistant or something like that. When we're hiring somebody right out of school or right off the street, as it were, there's a learning curve. They're going to have to go through a learning curve. And what happens during that learning curve, that's why we're able to pay them less, because they don't have any skills, is that they very, very rapidly grow on the job, and their value to us increases. But even more importantly, for the purpose of our talk today, their value out in the market increases dramatically. If you've ever thought about, the kind of wisdom you might have gotten from your parents, I remember my dad always saying, that degree of yours is great, but your degree and a year of experience is going to make all the difference in the world. And think about how you actually hire people. The body of knowledge that people have is great, but you're also looking for the fact that that's actually been applied somewhere, someplace where you can get a reference, or someplace where somebody has learned to do the job, so that you don't have to train people. One of the problems with health centers, and I can tell you, because while I didn't spend any time on my bio, I've been working with health centers for 27 years now. And the complaint we hear the most often, the most frequent, is we hire people, we weed through, we find the good ones, we train them, and then they walk down the street for somebody to go work for somebody else because we can't afford to keep them. And so what we become is the training ground. And because our jobs are harder, we do a better job in many cases of training people for jobs that will eventually be easier, where people will actually make more money. And this is what happens, because if you look at that green line up on the screen, that reflects the value of somebody. If you look at the surveys and what people are worth at various stages of their career, if there's a difference of, say, 15, maybe 20% at the most, between what you pay to somebody who's just walking in the door, say the minimum of your pay range, and what they're worth when they're fully functional on the job, that could be 15, 20% easily. And after that, once they've reached that, we have the general market inflation that occurs. So in this case, we assumed about a 15% increase from the minimum of the range to whatever our 100% green box on our organization chart value is. And then we just carried it out over time, with the market sort of increasing the way the market does. When we looked at what we do, and by we, I mean, frankly, most employers, it's not just health centers, it's pretty much everybody. That red line represents what we do with people over time, which is to give them about an average, if we're doing well, of about 3% a year. So if you just kind of superimpose those two on each other, what you see is that as long as our red line is below that green line, our employees have a better than 50% chance of finding employment at a higher rate of pay for the same work. And in some cases, as you can see, kind of between, I don't know, let's call it years 2 and 5, it's where the gap is the biggest. And it's no surprise that the studies will all show that most turnover occurs at that point in time. People don't want to leave right away because they don't want to look like job hoppers, but at the same time, they need, in many cases, to leave, and they can't turn those offers down, particularly for those folks in the entry-level jobs who are actually really concerned primarily with buying groceries on Friday. making the rent payments, getting the car fixed, whatever those things happen. So if you extend this out, you'd find out that actually those two lines will cross at about 18 years. So for the first 18 years of our entry-level folks who started from scratch, maybe right out of school, we're paying them not just a little bit less than the market, but considerably less than the market. And we should expect that that will result in some things. What's it going to mean? Well, let's go into some things and talk about exactly what it's going to mean. How do they impact us? Well, they impact us in several ways, and there's going to be a slide on each one of these. Organizationally, the type of staff that we're able to get. That is, what is the labor pool that's available to us because we do this? What is the quantity of staff that is necessary to achieve our objectives? Because again, the quality may not be as great, hence the quantity may need to be more. It's going to look at it's going to reflect organizational performance, the individual effectiveness, how well people are even able to approach becoming a green box on the organization chart. What is our turnover cost and how does turnover impact? And then something it's a very big topic these days because people are starting to recognize that those employees who are not engaged in the work are not performing at the level that they need to. And as a result, we have trouble as organizations meeting our mission. So let's hit those one at a time. Organization. We assume, as I mentioned earlier, that each box on an organization chart represents successful performance of a set of duties and responsibilities. But if we set ourselves up, that is, our pay program is not going to deliver the amount of pay necessary to pay for someone to achieve those objectives and those duties and responsibilities, the job simply can't be performed as designed. It's just that we don't have the ability to get people who can do that kind of work. Perhaps that means that some functions are diverted from one job to another. A supervisor has to pick up a task because the employee can't handle it. Or maybe some of these things are not performed at all. Also, the volume of work won't be as expected. We plan for, X number of procedures to be done, or Y number of forms to be filled, or Z number of medical records to be cleared. Whatever it is, we plan for something, but if we do not pay for the kinds of skills necessary to achieve that, what typically happens is that more people are needed. We end up with more people doing the job simply because originally we thought we could get X out of one box. Turns out we get X minus 5. So that means whatever 5 isn't being done. And to catch up, we are going to need to increase the number of people. So what happens is we just don't, we essentially makes those boxes impossible to be green. We change job complexity, one of the biggest problems that we see at health centers. So we design a job to handle a number of tasks at a certain capacity with minimal supervision. That's sort of the objective. So think about our front desk people. Perhaps we have somebody at the front desk who is supposed to do 6 different things. They check people in, they make referral calls, they gather financial information, whatever it is. Let's just say there's 6 of those things. If we can't afford to hire the kinds of people who can do X number of tasks at a certain capacity with minimal supervision, what's going to happen? Well, if we can't afford that, and I put that in quotes because I really think we can, we may be splitting one job into multiple jobs that can be performed by people you can afford. So maybe we siphon off one of those 6 items and we create another job whose sole purpose is to do just that. Maybe that's making referral calls because we don't have time to do the referral calls at the front desk. Or perhaps it's qualifying people for a sliding fee scale because the folks at the front desk can't handle that. So we siphon this up and we add people to come to pick up, not for jobs that can't be performed, but for jobs that can't be performed by the people that we hire because of what we're able to pay. Maybe we just need to frankly add more people to get to capacity. We thought that 20 patients could be seen by somebody an hour at the front desk, but it turns out that the people that we're hiring can only handle 10. Well, that means we need twice as many people. We sometimes will do other things like adding lead roles. I had a client the other day. I said, why do you have a lead in a department with 3 people? And they said, well, the other 2 people really can't do all of the stuff that we need them to do. So we have to have somebody that we pay more to do more of the work. That just frankly doesn't make sense. Sure, there are needs for leads, there are needs for supervisors. But if we have to create positions solely because folks can't be trusted to do their job, because they need more supervision or they need more guidance, then we're either diverting those supervisors or managers from their duty, or once again, we're adding more bodies. So kind of the theme here becomes, look, if we're not planning things right and we're not paying right, our organization chart's going to start failing. Changing the number of people. So we designed jobs to be performed by a certain number of people. That's why there were 45 boxes on those, on that original chart. If we end up with a different type of people, and by this I mean literally people who cannot make it up to our original level, our original standard, sometimes what we end up with is less reliable people. They're less reliable, not just because they're bad people, which we're hoping none of them are, but maybe they're less reliable because we're not paying enough for them to have consistent transportation to work, or because they can't afford childcare and have to leave, or can't afford to find someone to take care of their children when they get sick. When people are less reliable, it means more absenteeism, and then we have to add people for coverage. You know, I had a client once a few years back that had 6 people at the front desk, but they actually had 8 people to cover the clinic. They literally had 33% more staff because of absenteeism, and also because of turnover, because those jobs were frequently unfilled because people were leaving and it would take weeks to get new people. So we had all of these extra floating people floating around to cover for this. Is that something that you should assume to be the case? Absolutely not. There's no reason to assume that 25 to 30% turnover is normal. And in fact, reducing turnover through better spending of our employment dollars is actually one way to improve performance overall. So lower pay increases the chance of turnover, which of course will also increase the times when jobs are unfilled, because it takes longer to find the right people when we're not paying enough. And it results in overall lower expertise and in what's going on a daily basis, because the people who are actually on the job don't have as much experience. They don't know the ins and outs of our organization. And as a result, they can't perform the way we need them to perform. So we've changed the job complexity. We've changed the number of people. Let's look at the individuals. What does it mean on individual productivity? And I'm not just speaking to our providers here, but lower staff skills produce lower results. We know that. We know that intuitively. If people are not as good at their work, they don't do it as well, and they need to be corrected more. They don't do it as fast. Capacity is decreased because maybe our medical assistants simply can't deal with 3 patients at a time, and we have to drop it to 2. Our quality is decreased because our skill levels are decreased. We've got more work, more do-overs to go. We've got more medical records that aren't accurate and more bills that have to be followed up on because they weren't done correctly. Overall, that lower labor pool and the lower retention rate of people with certain skill sets is going to hit us both in terms of capacity and in quality. And that lower staff skill influences others. And if I do have any doctors or other providers in the room, you'll know exactly what I'm speaking to, because other people are distracted from their responsibilities when folks are not doing their job well. I often tell people when they ask me, how are we going to design a new incentive program to get our providers to see more patients? The first question I always ask is, are the patients actually, or the providers actually able to see as many patients as you want them to right now? Or are we having trouble because patients are in line so long at the front desk that they end up leaving? I was at a health center about 5 years ago when the CFO actually told me that the average wait time for patients in their clinic was 2.5 hours to actually see the provider. And of course, that meant that many of those people did not wait the 2.5 hours and they left. So they might have scheduled and they didn't double book for some strange reason, but they might have, set up 18 appointments for a provider for a day, but that provider would only see 9 people because the other 9 left. Other situations occur when the timing is bad, when scheduling is bad. Working with an organization right now where they're concerned that their front desk people just don't understand the procedures that they're scheduling people for. So they'll set up a whole bunch of appointments with new patients at the end of the day. Okay, well, the slot's filled. This is a new patient slot. It's an hour, it's a half an hour, whatever it is. But the fact that we all know that those types of of initial visits or patients with chronic issues are going to take longer. They're frequently going to go over that time. And if you back up a provider at the end of the day, which is when it always seems to happen, and they're there an hour and a half past the time the clinic closes just to see those patients, we are not going to be as productive. We're distracted from achieving our responsibility. It directly affects the ability of providers to see patients, and I see this all the time. So please, if you take absolutely nothing from this seminar other than the idea that please don't try to get your providers to see more patients through an incentive plan until you've checked to find out if all the impediments for those providers seeing patients have been eliminated. And frankly, you will find that most of those are actually skill-related things. And this translates directly to morale. You know, a lot of times we talk about recruitment and retention of providers, and we think that that's the only recruitment and retention we have to do. And we forget that one of the big things that providers report in terms of their work-life satisfaction is the skill and the tenure of the support staff they have. If they're unable to build that level of trust with the folks they're working with, if they're unable to know that they're going to do their job, their morale decreases. And frankly, they spend a lot of time covering for those other folks, and it ends up being, as we could say, a whole mess. So it does definitely have an impact on recruitment and retention. Now we've got cost related simply to other factors like turnover. What does turnover cost? Well, there's the sort of raw cost measure that the accountants will tell you to use. It's your turnover rate multiplied by the number of employees, multiplied by the average employment cost, times some kind of average cost of turnover multiple, which depending on which accountant you talk to could be anywhere from a quarter of a year's pay when we're talking about entry-level people, all the way up to 1.5 to 2 times annual pay when we're talking about providers. And so there's a definite financial cost, and it's not something that we can just pull right out of our financial statements, but it is a cost that is there. The higher the percentage your turnover is, the less effective you are with your expenses. But it's not just that turnover has this raw cost, it also has another cost, which is the lost productivity, the diversion of staff from their work, all of the other things that we talked about earlier. I can have a perfectly competent, in fact, I can have a highly skilled manager who becomes 40 or 50% efficient because they're spending so much time doing the work of the people that they manage. And so while that person from a quality perspective may well be a 100% green box, from a practical matter and a practical perspective, they may be only functioning at 50% of capacity. And that's just as bad as if they were a poor employee. So we have these costs that hit us in multiple directions. And that's why it's so important to go back and say, am I paying the right amount for the skills that I need? Because this is going to flow through. We have some other impacts that are worth mentioning. The cost of engagement. Unfairly paid employees are likely to be unsatisfied. I think that we probably already accept that, but even if we don't accept it, it's been proven by numerous studies. The Gallup organization is famous for all the data that they have out there. Unfairly paid employees are likely to be unsatisfied, and that plays out. Unsatisfied employees are less likely to be engaged. Even if they go through their daily task, they do it without a lot of enthusiasm. They are not going to find new ways for work to be done that'll make them more efficient. These things are frankly just not going to happen. And what you lose, again, is the same thing that you lose because a manager is inefficient on the job. Your green boxes start getting less and less green. Each box, whether it's a person who is not engaged or the manager of the person who is not engaged, or maybe the person at the next desk who says, you know, that person is slacking off and getting paid as if they weren't, so why should I work hard? Now, I don't want to come off as sounding that like all employees are bad, because they're not, and most of our employees are really good. But if we are not making sure that our employees are focused on their work and not focused on whether they can pay for groceries on Friday night, or whether the person next to them is getting paid more simply because they haven't gotten fired for a long time, people will respond and they will behave accordingly. And usually that's not good for you. Because one of the things I can tell you, and people always ask me this at the end of projects, employees are not going to be excited and over the moon because you have a good compensation plan. And the reason they're not going to do that is because that's what they expect, and that's what they have a right to expect. So you're almost never going to get excellent rewards and pats on the back for doing things the way you're supposed to be doing them. But what you are going to get is negative feedback when you're not doing it right. And that negative feedback is not just complaints, it's not just lower employee satisfaction scores, but it's actual performance on the job. And disengaged employees, those are the worst. Those are the ones who are there because they have to be, because they can't leave, because you're the only job in town for them, or you're paying them so much because they've been around for 30 years and not get fired, that they can't afford to leave. Some of them actively damage their employers. They do it through employee theft. They do it through sabotage. And I think the Gallup number, last I checked, was about 7% of employees are actively disengaged and are actively damaging their employers. Those who are not disengaged but not engaged actually make up roughly 50% of the employee population right now, and some estimates are closer to 60. And what those people are doing is simply not performing at 100%. Maybe they're performing at 95 or 90 or 80 or some other number less than that. But remember, long ago, when we designed that pretty organization chart with all the green boxes, we assumed 100%. And so if we have a workforce that is not performing at 100%, one of two things happens. We either add more people and more jobs to cover for that, which of course directly hits our bottom line, or we just don't achieve those objectives. Remember that if we have gone and we've benchmarked our performance and we've benchmarked our costs, we should know that we should be getting X for Y. And if we're not getting our X, our input, we're not going to get our Y. And so organizations that will sit there and say, well, we just can't, it's not that we can't, it's just that we're not allocating our resources the right way. So we have to watch for those disengaged employees. We really want every box on our organization chart to actually be green, because that's when we know that we've got the right number of people doing the right kind of work. What are the impacts of a poor performance appraisal process, which is frequently a component of pay programs? Sometimes they simply allow employees who have not mastered the job to remain employed. If we have 10 things that employees need to do in job X, and we let them get away with only doing 7, and we don't terminate or train or move them on to something else, we're building in a box that's never going to be green. If we have people who are allowed to excel at a couple items on their job and fail at a couple of others, and I think you might know where I'm going here, but if you have one of those wonderful 5-point performance appraisal systems and you get 3 things you get 5s on because you're exceeding expectations, and you get 3 things you get a 1 on because you're poor, that averages out to 3. And in most systems like that, where 3 means meets expectations, it looks like you've got a green box, but you don't, because you've got some of the job being performed, but not all of it. So we literally build this into our programs where we allow employees who have not mastered the job to remain. Frequently, we fail to correct or develop because we just don't want to deal with those issues. Or maybe somebody is 5 years away from retirement and we just don't want to deal with it because it's only 5 years. And granted, that is taking the long run or taking the long look at things. But what it means is, again, our boxes aren't green. These things impact other employees. One of the things that I always say that management is actually terrified of addressing performance issues, not because they don't want to address the person who's a problem, but because they feel that they will be scaring other people. Well, if I actually discipline Sally because she hasn't been to work for 8 days in a row, are the other employees going to be afraid that I'm going to be disciplining them too? You know what actually happens? Generally speaking, what actually happens when that person is disciplined, all the other employees' first comment is, why did it take you so long? Because those other folks' jobs are being impacted by the people who aren't doing their jobs well. Those other people are not green boxes because some people are distracting them from their work or making them do other work. So all of this just impacts other employees. So let's go back and look at this for a second, and let's look at our picture. this is an organization as it was designed. There are 45, it should be, 45 boxes on this organization chart. And we assume that if we have hired the right person, every person is doing the job the way they're supposed to, and those people are interacting with other employees, contributing to their managers or working with their teams, and that everybody is getting things done the way they are supposed to do. We've benchmarked this. If we have this group of people, we will achieve our number of encounters or our number of patients served or our quality guidelines or whatever it is that we're supposed to do. Here's the problem though. After enough time with these pay programs that are doing those things that I've mentioned in the last few slides, we end up with something that looks a lot more like this. So we can maybe go back to our little homework assignment from earlier, and you can look at your own organization chart when you get a chance later on and look at it. And what you'll find is, if you're being honest, you will have some people who are really, really good people, but functionally are not green boxes. And they may not be green boxes simply because they are distracted by the people who work for them. And that's one of the features of this analysis that actually I probably should have added to the homework. It's not just about, are they good people? Will they ever be able to achieve it? But are they actually doing it? And in a lot of cases, are they actually doing it isn't a function of how good they are, but it's a function of the organization and how it operates. So on the right side of your screen there, you see a red box at what's clearly a senior management job. Does it mean that that's a bad person? No, not at all. It may simply mean that the 4 yellow boxes and the 2 red boxes that report into that person are just so distracting and so disruptive that my senior manager is frankly unable to do his or her job. I have a client who's a CEO of a small health center, a small rural health center. It's got about 40 or 45 people in it, kind of like this one. And I've told her that in our little homework assignment, I think her box is bright red. And first time I said that to her, she was quite offended. And I said, no, I think you're a really good person. I think you're highly skilled. In fact, you might even be considered brilliant. You've got all kinds of degrees, and you perform on task forces, and you work with your PCA, and you do a fantastic job. But you know what? You have this one problem. You have such high turnover in your front desk staff that when the line gets 3 or 4 people deep, you run out there and you work at the front desk in order to make sure that every patient gets served quickly. And I'm going to tell you it's a very noble thing to do, but it makes that person's performance, it makes her performance as a CEO not what it should be. Because that organization is paying, I want to put a round number on it, about $120,000 a year for somebody who is spending a quarter of their time working at the front desk. And that's not a good use of money. And so that box is red. I hate to say it, but no matter how good she is as a CEO, that box is red because she's not doing her job. So what might this mean? I just threw some numbers together just for fun so that we could play with the math a little bit. And what I decided is, for the purpose of our exercise, and you can pick anything you want, but for the purpose of our exercise, I assumed that every green box was 100%. I assumed that every yellow box was 75%. That is, 75% of the job was being done. And for every red box, I assumed that 50% of the job as designed was actually being done. So one of the things you're going to look at here, and you may have guessed, is that there are not 45 boxes on this organization chart. Because of all the things that this organization had to do to actually get things done, they ended up with 52 boxes. They split up some responsibilities, they added some people. All the things that they needed to do to accomplish that, to achieve their mission, what this nice green organization chart on the prior slide had in 45 people, this one has 52. So how did I do the math, and how did I come to that conclusion? Well, the initial structure, 45 people at 100% is 45. It's exactly what we expected. The result of the changes that this organization needed to make to get to doing the work of 45 people. Well, I had 32 people who were doing the job at 100%. Easy math, 32 times 1 is 32. 12 people are doing the yellow boxes. We're doing 75%. So they're really doing the work of 9 people. And my 8 red boxes, assuming they were working at 50%, they're doing the work of 4 people. So what I end up with is I do get my total of 45, just like my ideal structure. But in order to do that, I have 15% more people, 7 more people. What does that mean? Well, it may be that, you know, my pay structure is set so low that my cost is effectively the same. But even if my pay was the same, which I'm willing to bet you it isn't, I'm absorbing the cost of 7 more people, 15% more in benefits costs. I'm assuming the cost of more training. I'm assuming a lot of burden. When I've added 15% of my workforce, my costs are probably going to go up by more than 15%. So what I'm doing here is, if I was to benchmark performance, I would probably find that I don't have as much net income as my peers who are seeing the same amount of patients with the same amount of revenue, because I'm spending more. Or maybe the flip side is happening. I'm spending the same amount as my peers, but I'm not getting the results. Whatever it is, my organization is not the organization that I meant to have in the first place. So when I suggest you go back and look at your organization chart and you draw some colors and you think about whether these are tasks that are not being performed and that's why I'm making it red, or these are people that are never going to succeed in the job and that's why it's going to make it red. Whatever reason it's red, that is having an impact on your organization. And when you look at those, try to look at the whys. Now, clearly, when the whys are people who are not doing the job because they're not qualified or because they're not performing at the level they're supposed to simply because they don't want to, those are situations where you need to start thinking about what this is doing to your organization and how long you can actually tolerate that. If it's a function of the fact that you're not paying enough, and particularly if you're not paying enough to those folks who report to our little red box, maybe that's the issue. Maybe improving the performance of those people you can even model. If I could actually hire people. And it's funny because frequently you talk to frontline supervisors, they almost always tell you the same thing. If I could just pay a little more, I wouldn't have these problems. So trust them. Well, trust some of them at least. If in fact they know that they could find better people and that they could actually get the job done, look at that as a possible solution. Because I think in total, what you'll find is your costs are actually going to go down if you do this. And if you look at what your pay program is doing and spot all those problems with it and deal with them early on, we're going to end up with an organization that's performing better overall. So in summary of all this, we know every job has a particular value. And that's a function of the contribution of the job to the organization. It's a factor of the cost of the skills in the market. And it's a factor of the individual employee's ability to master their job requirements. Employees are only filling their position when they're at 100%. If they're not at 100%, they're not doing the work the way the job has been designed. Maybe years ago when we first thought of how many people it would take to see how many patients, our pay programs may not allow us to do that. And if they don't allow us to do that, we need to go back and look at why. So if you're saying, hey, Ed, you know what? If you're saying I need to pay 5% more to all my people, I can't afford that because that's 5% more. Well, maybe it's not just that you have to spend 5% across your entire budget. Maybe it means that spending 5% will allow you to have 8% fewer employees, and you end up with a net cost. And again, you know, we're talking business-like here, and I'm not suggesting you need to go terminate people tomorrow morning. A lot of these things get phased in over time. But look at your pay program and see if, in fact, by improving the way you pay, and sometimes it's not just the amount, it's the way you pay. If you improve the way you pay, you may end up with fewer employees doing much more. Failing to pay that value causes us to increase staff. It causes us, frankly, to decrease expectations and to change jobs. And overall, to be effective, we need to go back to that first process slide where we started with the mission and we went to strategies and we went to processes, and we need to go back to that. And we need to go back to that frequently, not just once every 10 or 15 years, but we need to go back to that, particularly whenever we change our mission or whenever we change our strategy or whenever we do things differently, and look to see if those programs that we have in place are actually designed to achieve our objectives. And that as we do this, because remember what I said earlier, the best pay program in the world is going to fail if it isn't implemented and administered correctly. So to be effective, the programs have to be designed and implemented to achieve our objectives. I do want to thank you all for listening today. Last time we ran out of time at the end for questions because I tried to pack a little bit more than I could into our program. But as was mentioned earlier, you are free if you want to ask questions right now to do so. If you do not have the time or haven't thought of the questions yet, please do not hesitate to contact us or to route your questions through Mariah. On the screen is our contact information, our website. You can also feel free to look at our blog, which is at the bottom. It addresses primarily compensation issues, all dedicated toward the Community and Migrant Health Center movement. We'll probably have addressed most of the questions that you might have somewhere along the way. So I will turn it back to the staff. If there are any questions, feel free to please pass them along.
All right, thank you so much, Ed, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. We'll leave the line open just a couple of minutes here if anybody has some questions. We didn't see any come in during the presentation, but if you have them now, feel free to drop them in the chat box or into the questions box and we'll pass them along. As Ed said, you can also email us once you hop off this webinar. My contact information is in the chat box, Mariah Blake at mblake@clinicians.org, or you can contact Ed at his information here. All right, I'm not seeing any questions coming in just yet, so we will go ahead and hop off the line, but we look forward to having everybody back with us for our next webinar in the series on December 19th. All right, thank you all so much. You have a great day.